Hello and welcome to Teaching and Learning with RStudio Cloud. My name is Mina Chetinkara-Randell. I am a professional educator and a data scientist with RStudio, as well as a professor of the practice at Duke University in the Statistical Science Department. I've been teaching and learning in RStudio for many years now, and over the last few years I've really enjoyed being able to teach with RStudio Cloud. In this webinar, I want to talk to you a little bit about what RStudio Cloud is, how you can teach and learn with it, and I want to particularly highlight some of the new developments in RStudio Cloud that I think would be of interest to educators. The webinar will be streamed live on YouTube, and I will be also answering questions during the live stream. So if you think of any questions as we're going through things, please put them in the chat and I will be there to answer them. And you can also see a link on the slides, rstd.io/tl-rscloud, and that's where you can find the PDF of the slides as well. So let's start with what is RStudio Cloud. RStudio Cloud is a lightweight cloud-based solution that allows anyone to do, share, teach, and learn data science online in the browser. So all you need is a computer with an internet connection and a browser to be able to start computing with R. You do not actually need to install anything. So there's nothing to configure, no dedicated hardware, and no installation. And that's what I think makes it really easy for students to get started with computing, and that's what makes it RStudio Cloud an attractive choice for teaching. So let's talk a little bit about RStudio Cloud. This is what RStudio Cloud looks like when you've logged on. So over here you can see a little link that says New Project, and I'm going to click on that and I'm going to select New RStudio Project. This takes a second to deploy a project, which is basically the same as an RStudio project. I can give it a name in the web user interface, and the rest of it is basically the RStudio IDE that you're accustomed to. And you can see that I can start computing right away. So let's start by asking the question, why might we want to use RStudio in the cloud? If we are actually teaching with a local installation, the students, when they first come to class, they would need to first install R and then install RStudio, and then maybe install a bunch of packages that you're going to use, then load these packages. If you're teaching with version control, they will also need to install Git, and that has a lot of potential friction points. Maybe some steps are easier than others, but if we were to actually try to go through each of these steps with the audience right now, we probably wouldn't be able to get through it so quickly. On the other hand, when you are teaching with RStudio Cloud, what you can tell your students is go to RStudio Cloud, just log in and start coding. Much less friction to get started with. So how might you access RStudio in the cloud? You have a couple options. Your first option is using RStudio Workbench, which is basically a professional product offered by RStudio. This requires that you yourself as an educator either have some sysadmin experience or you have some IT support who can help you set this up. You also need either a hardware to run this piece of software, a local virtual machine, or some cloud computing credits, because your students are going to be computing somewhere, and that needs to happen either in the cloud where you're paying for it, or you have credit for it, or on a local hardware. Obviously, you also need to have RStudio experience because you are teaching with RStudio. If this actually defines you well, RStudio makes RStudio Workbench, licenses it for free as part of their academic pricing. So you can go to rstudio.com/pricing/academic-pricing, and you can read a little bit about it. I think they want something like a syllabus to show that you're going to be using this for teaching, and you can get that. And if this is of interest to you, we actually have a paper in the American Statistician called Infrastructure and Tools for Teaching Computing Throughout the Statistical Curriculum, where we go into the details of how you can set this up for your students. But as you saw, there's lots that's needed to be able to get started with this. And if you neither have the sysadmin experience or you don't have the IT support available to you, this may be a little bit out of reach. With RStudio Cloud, really all you need to have is RStudio experience and nothing else. So I think that's one thing that makes it quite attractive as an educator, especially if you're teaching statistics or data science. You may not have the sysadmin experience, or you may not have the resources listed there to be able to run this stuff locally. So next question is, fine, maybe I've convinced you that teaching your students how to use R and RStudio in the cloud is a good idea, that they should be just going to their web browser and starting doing computing. Why RStudio Cloud then, and maybe not some other option? Well, let's talk about RStudio Cloud in a nutshell. We already said that it does not require IT experience to set up. It also has some features designed for teaching. For example, you can organize your classes as a workspace. You can leverage roles, so you can have different roles for your instructor, yourself, your teaching assistants, or your students. You can turn projects into assignments, which is using vocabulary your students are familiar with. You can actually peek into student projects, which is hugely helpful when you're trying to help them out, especially remotely. And you can ensure the same setup for all the student projects using the concept of a base project that we'll touch on in a little bit. Additionally, certain system libraries work out of the box, like you can, get started with Git without actually having to install it. And you can knit to PDF and Word out of the box as well, as opposed to having your students, having locally set up something like LaTeX or having access to Microsoft Word. Let's talk a little bit about projects in RStudio Cloud, which is basically how we encapsulate our work and how we organize it. There are three types of projects. The first one is the RStudio project that we have already seen. We had created this project. I had named it my first RStudio project. I've also shown you that, you can do plotting and whatnot. It's basically the IDE you're familiar with, and we're typing R code here. An alternative is a Jupyter project. This is a new feature and it's in beta, so there may be changes to it. There will probably be updates to it. But you can go to the same menu and choose a Jupyter project, and you can see that you're basically finding yourself in a Jupyter notebook, and you can launch it, and you can start running some Python code there as well. Now, you can also run Python code in the RStudio IDE via the Reticulate package. So this is not the only way that you could be using RStudio Cloud for teaching Python, but using Jupyter notebooks is beyond just teaching Python. This is just one example where you're actually running Python code. Additionally, you can start a project from a Git repository. This is something I use very regularly because I teach using Git and GitHub. I teach Git as a version control system, but we also use GitHub as kind of our learning management system. Every assignment is a repository for my students, and so they go to GitHub first, grab their private repository that's named to them, and then they bring in the files that I have put in that repository to get started. That's basically doing a Git clone, if you're familiar with that language. In order to do this in RStudio Cloud, I can again click on New Project, say New Project from Git, and paste the URL of the project. I'm going to simply clone the praise package that basically generates some random praise that you can use in your work or in your other packages. And you can see that basically we've cloned that project, and I can continue working with this. The RStudio IDE already provides a Git tab for me anyway. As soon as it recognizes that this is a Git version controlled project, and I can start interacting with it that way and push and pull to GitHub. All right, so we've talked about the three ways that you could be working in RStudio Cloud and creating projects. So let's talk a little bit about teaching with RStudio Cloud. I tend to think of my teaching experiences in one of these two kind of types, either shorter engagement teaching or longer engagement teaching. What I mean by shorter engagement teaching is it's maybe a workshop, like a couple hours, a short course at a conference for 4 hours, or maybe even a full day. But more importantly than time, perhaps, is the amount of content, where content, I think, can be organized in one or just a few projects that I could share with my learners. And additionally, in this kind of engagement, I'm generally not interested in keeping track of my learners. So I don't have things like have students completed their homework, or maybe I don't, after the teaching engagement is over, have a need to go peek into their project to provide additional support to them. If this is the case, I would recommend that you use kind of the simpler approach of just share a single project with your learners. If we're thinking about a longer engagement, for me, that's usually a semester-long course, a multi-day workshop, or something like that. And again, from the content perspective, where content can be best organized in multiple projects. Additionally, I want to keep track of my learners. I want to know who my students are. I want to know if they're in my workspace. I want to know if they've started their work. I want to be able to provide guidance to them by sometimes peeking into their projects. If this defines your teaching engagement, then the approach where you invite your students to a workspace where you have organized the content is, I think, a better approach. So let's start with the slightly simpler one, where I said would be, I believe, better suited for a shorter engagement teaching. In this case, we're sharing an RStudio Cloud project, and we'll give the example of a single RStudio Cloud project. But as I said, you know, if it's just 2 or 3 of them and you want to share them individually, that's probably not too confusing for your learners. Versus in a longer engagement, you might have 10 homework assignments and 10 labs and a project and whatnot, and you probably don't want to individually share links for each and every one of those. So how does this go? We're going to be looking at the instructor view now. So I have created on RStudio Cloud a single project, and I have named it Introduction to Shiny. You can see that on the top left corner of my screen. And you can see that I've created this project in what is called your workspace. So this is my personal workspace. And there I've created project called Introduction to Shiny, which, let's say, is the short course that I'm going to teach at a conference. In the Files tab, you can see that I have created some folders where I've organized the content. So if we take a look at one of those folders, let's start with the first module maybe. I have some slides, I have an app in there that the students are going to work with, a few other app examples that I'm going to teach with. Since I'm teaching Shiny, I definitely want to install the Shiny package, probably other packages too, but to keep things simple, let's also install the Shiny package. So in this project, I have installed the Shiny package now, and let's also just confirm that it's been installed. One thing I like to do is I just try to load the package. Does that work? Let's do library Shiny. That seems to be working okay. And I'm going to say we're good to go and share this content with the students. So you can see all the structure for the workshop is there. I'm going to click on that little gear icon, go to Access, and for who can view this project, I'm going to say everyone. And then I am going to go up to the URL and simply copy that link. That's it. That's all I need to share this content with my students. And you can see that by using a nice kind of folder structure, I've been able to organize the material for them. I like naming my folders in this way so learners know where we're at each point of a workshop, for example. So I've copied the URL after making the project available to everyone. So as soon as I turn that switch, it is available to the whole world, although who will be able to find that project ID? It's very unlikely that someone can stumble upon it unless I share the link with them. On the student view, now they receive that URL from their instructor, and so they go to their URL bar and simply paste it. And what they do is they need to now log in. So they're going to log in to RStudio Cloud. You can log in with Google, for example, and they can start computing. They see the same folder structure. Everything that I gave them is there. Remember, we installed the Shiny package. They're able to load it, so they don't have to reinstall it again. That's already there for them. They can see the content I've prepared for them. They could even right away go ahead and run the app, for example. From the student's perspective, this is a really nice way of getting started, right? We really didn't have to teach them, or at least spend time during the workshop, which is about Introduction to Shiny in this hypothetical case, about how to set things up for them. So let's talk a little bit about this notion of sharing a single RStudio Cloud project to disseminate your teaching materials. On the plus side, students land directly in a project upon login, right? They get the URL and they're in the RStudio IDE, which I think is perfect. It's great for sharing code in general too. So I tend to think about this approach not just in the context of teaching, but also in the context of collaboration. Or, sometimes you have this reproducible example that's not quite minimal, that still perhaps takes a lot of code, and you really want someone to be able to dive into your computing environment and see what you're doing. That's what it's also great for, just being able to share your entire environment with them. On the potentially minus side, I don't know if your eye caught that, but on the top of the window on the student view, you could see in red the words temporary copy. So students need to remember to make a permanent copy of the project you share with them. And they can do that. That red text blinks, that hopefully gets their attention, and there's a little button right next to it that says save a permanent copy. But really what I mean by this bullet point is that it is on you as the instructor to remind them to do that. Because as soon as they make a permanent copy, their work will be saved. They could close their browser window, they could lose power, it doesn't matter, they can come back and pick up where they left off. However, if they have not made the permanent copy and started working on it, and then they close their window, they're going to actually lose their work. And there's nothing more frustrating to a student than that. So this is totally avoidable, but you as the instructor will need to remind them. You can't keep track which students started their assignment. So this URL just goes out into the world, and anyone who has access to that can use it, but you don't have a way of monitoring who have made copies of your project and started their assignment. If a student wants help from you in a way where they would want you to peek into their project, you need to be granted permission in order to be able to do that. So that's an additional step for the students to have to do. Now, there are two other bullet points I want to discuss, and these could be pluses for some of you and minuses for others. These permanent projects, once a student makes a permanent project, count towards the student's free hours on RStudio Cloud. For some, this might be okay because maybe you are teaching in a situation where you are not going to be kind of responsible for the cost of the compute. Your learners are going to be. So in that case, this might be okay. Chances are, if you're teaching in a university setting, for example, where students have already paid for the course and do not expect to incur additional charges, they probably would not want to be put in a situation where they have a limited number of free hours to work on their assignment. We want students to be working on things as long as they want to and not have these kind of artificial limits on their learning. Additionally, students control permissions. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? It again depends. If you're teaching in a graded course, you may not want this because it's a too easy a way perhaps for them to share their work with their classmates, which might constitute some sort of academic misconduct. But you might be teaching in a little workshop where this is perfectly fine. So again, depending on your situation, these could be pros or cons. Let's talk also about inviting to an RStudio Cloud workspace, which is the second method of sharing your materials that I mentioned, which is for longer engagement projects. So here, what we're going to do on the instructor view is, you can see this is my account. I have a bunch of projects to myself in my workspace, but I'm going to click on the little kind of hamburger menu there, open the sidebar, and create a new space. Let's say I'm teaching a longer workshop called Shiny Essentials. This was a 2-day workshop I taught this year, so I figured I'd reuse that name. And here I can see there's nothing in that workspace yet. I can create a new RStudio project and I can name it something. Maybe let's just name it 01 Getting Started again. Say that's going to be the first module in this particular longer workshop that I'm giving. So here again, we have an RStudio Cloud project, and I can change the access level to everyone, but this time it's not everyone in the world, it's everyone in this workspace, and I'm going to turn it into an assignment. So now when the students get invited to my workspace and land here, they're going to see that they have some assignments they need to start working on. This is not to say it's like homework, it's just something they can get started with. And in fact, on the student view, they see the word start instead of the word assignment there. You can see from a different, so a workshop that I actually did give that was designed in this way. For each of the assignments that I have created, I can see the derived project. So I could actually click on there and peek into students' projects. And this is a good way, the summary statistics here are a good way of gauging for you how many students have started, but also you can dive deeper and look into their projects, which is really nice, especially if they need help and you're teaching remotely and can't just kind of peek over their shoulder. In the Members tab of a workspace that you create like this, you have some options. You have some options about how you want to invite students to your workspace. I generally use the sharing link, so it creates a single link and I can pick a role for people who come into the workspace using that link, and we'll say more about the roles in a second, and simply either email that out, or if I'm teaching, share that during the first few minutes of the teaching engagement. I've covered some names up here in order not to show the real students' names on the webinar, but you can basically see that that would be how you can keep track of who is in your workspace. So the 4 roles that are available are admin, moderator, contributor, and viewer, and they have different permission levels. So admin is probably you, and you can do everything, including managing users. A moderator is usually the level of access I give my teaching assistants. They can view and edit and manage all projects, so they can go in and help students, but they don't end up managing the users, the actual students who get admitted into the place. Contributors are basically students who can only see their work. And then viewers, I generally use that for like an auditor in a course, or sometimes a guest, like a colleague will say, I'd like to see how you're doing things, but I don't necessarily want them to see the list of students, in my course in the members tab. So I give them that lowest level of access. We can also set permissions. These boxes will be unchecked by default, and I would encourage you to be carefully thinking about checking them. So do you want your contributors to see the members list? If you're teaching a public course, maybe not. Maybe if it's a small university course and you want everyone to know each other's names, maybe you do. Whether or not contributors, so that students can make their projects visible to all members. Again, we discussed this notion of potential academic misconduct that could happen by students being able to too easily share their work, perhaps. Not checking that box is not going to protect you from, everything that could go wrong, but we don't want to potentially be additionally making things easy for students if the way the course is set up is such that they shouldn't see each other's work, or if it is that they should be able to, then we could allow them to change that. And the third one is about whether they can change project resources, and that's getting into things like the memory and the compute that they're going to use, which gets tied into the pricing, which we'll say a couple things about at the very end. So think about these permission levels, but it's good to know that these are there, and you can toggle based on your own teaching situation. We also mentioned this notion of a base project. So here in the workspace, I've clicked on the gear icon for the workspace itself, where I could rename my course if I wanted to, but underneath it, you can see that I can set a base RStudio project. So these base projects they're basically any old RStudio Cloud project that you kind of delegate as the base project. This is where you can define the R version that will be used for all projects, what packages will be installed, and if there's any certain files that you want repeated across all of the projects in the course. For me, this is usually not data, because I usually tend to change, data files from assignment to assignment. But it's usually things like a code of conduct, maybe submission instructors, things that will stay constant throughout the assignment. And you can update it as many times as you like, which is really great, because if if there's a new package comes out, or a package gets updated and you want to change things up in the middle of the semester, you can go back and do that. And your changes are not retroactive for a good reason. You don't want to mess up students' work that happened prior to that time point. So any changes you make will only affect projects that are created after that change was made. So inviting your students to an RStudio Cloud workspace, lots of pluses in my opinion. Various permission levels, this notion of base projects with desired packages installed, the notion of assignments, which remove the need to remind students to make a copy of the project before starting work, and this ability to peek into student projects. Maybe on the minus side, one thing I can think of is that when students land in the workspace, they don't actually land in the RStudio IDE, right? They need to do an additional thing to figure out which project to go into next. So they may need instructions like start the assignment titled Getting Started or something like that. easy enough to handle, but something you need to remember as the instructor. And again, on could be a pro, could be a con side, students' work now counts towards yours. You know, this could be you as an instructor or your institution that might be paying for the particular level of RStudio Cloud for the workspace hours. And that could be a positive or it could be a negative depending on your situation. And instructor controls the permissions. And again, depending on the teaching engagement type you have, that may be a positive or a negative. I tend to find that for my university teaching, these are both pros for me, but for other types of teaching engagements, that might be different. Let's wrap things up with a few tips for teaching with RStudio Cloud. The first is that when you changes to an assignment student has started, won't propagate to student copy. So if you've set up an assignment for your students and then realized there was a typo or you forgot to add a data file, you're not going to be able to just change things up and then let it propagate. Once the students start their assignment, they're actually making a copy of that assignment at that snapshot of time point. So you're going to need to get that information to them in some other way. If you're teaching with Git, you could be updating the GitHub repositories and they could simply pull the changes from there. Otherwise, maybe you reach out to your students in some other way to let them know of the corrections. Packages in the base project are installed, but they're not loaded. So don't forget those library commands in the assignments that you give to the students. The latest information is always on the RStudio Cloud guide and the What's New page, and you can get to these from the hamburger menu on the left side of your RStudio Cloud window. So if you're thinking, how do I do X? The guide is probably the first place to look at. And if you encounter any sort of slowness or glitches, projects not starting up as quickly as they used to, the first place to check is the system status. So you can take from the left-hand menu, you can get under Help to the current system status. And if there is an outage, that will be noted there. If there isn't, but you're still experiencing this, or your students are experiencing it, then reach out to support to let them know. I would strongly recommend creating an additional account and log in as a student to see what they see, because what you see is not always what they see. And it's nice to be able to assure yourself that you've set things up the right way, especially the first few times you're teaching with a new technology. Test assignments to set sufficient computational resources. These are toggles that you can change. So you can see those little toggles on the side here. So make sure that you test to make sure that, the data size you have or the computation you're asking your students will actually work with the allocated kind of RAM and the CPUs. And if not, you will be able to toggle those up if you want. The whole peeking at your students' project feature is fantastic, but I believe you might want to use that sparingly, or at least I try to use that sparingly, because the first thing that I want to get my students to do is to learn to articulate the issues they're having without me going in and fixing it for them. That being said, sometimes they may not have the right vocabulary especially if they're very new to computing, to R, to RStudio. So it's nice to be able to push them to articulate these. But if that's not getting anywhere and you're getting frustrated or the student is getting frustrated, it's really nice to be able to peek in. And it's additionally helpful for remote teaching situations, as you can imagine. The assignment feature, even though the word is assignment, I try not to think of it as just homework. I also try to think of it as, if I'm going to be doing some live coding in class, I like to write out a skeleton for myself where I will be filling in the code. And I use that feature to share that code starter with the students so that some of them, if they actually want to code along with me, they have that to get started with. A couple other useful resources. There is now a nice playlist with 14 very short and informative videos about how to do much of what I talked about and more with RStudio Cloud. And there's a short link for it on the top of the screen, rstd.io/cloud-playlist. So you can take a look at those and watch through them. And if you are going to be using RStudio Cloud for teaching or for other purposes where you think there will be maybe heavy usage, lots of students, or maybe lots of projects, take a look at the pricing options. There is always a free option, although as soon as you're thinking about a classroom with a substantial number of students, the free option may not be the right one for you, may not be sufficient anymore. So I would recommend especially taking a look at the Cloud Instructor pricing plan, and also reaching out to the RStudio sales folks who work on this to just describe your situation of number of students and the type of course you're teaching, to let them help guide you to figure out the best pricing option for you. Thank you very much for tuning in, and we'll hang out a little bit in the chat on YouTube as well to answer your questions. Once again, you can find the slides at rstd.io/tl-rscloud if you'd like to see a PDF version of those as well. Have a great day.